Greetings all, and welcome to the 5th segment of A Traveler's Guide 2 for the B.S.L Research Station. And today, we will be continuing with a look at the vessel with the next segment, A Traveler's Guide to Sector 4 AQA. Sector 4 was designed as a habitat for aquatic organisms, both amphibious and completely isolated to an aquatic lifestyle. The sector itself is divided into two main areas, with the upper area being filled with display tanks and machinery that was designed for testing and measuring the power of semi-aquatic creatures and other specimens that are simply too large to keep in the lower sectors, such as the monster Ceres. The lower portion of the sector was completely flooded and exists as a pristine artificial marine ecosystem filled with beasts like the Sculpteras and the Evirs, all taken and kept safe prior to the destruction of Zebes. Upon first entering this area, the hunter was unable to enter the water because broken electrical cables had electrified the water. The more controlled destruction in the area was likely the doing of an SAX, but the more senseless destruction of the upper area was caused instead by the rampaging Ceres. Since there was no way to shut off the station's power without making the spread of the X-parasites even worse, the hunter had to traverse the upper corridors and activate the pump control unit in order to lower the water level, though only after defeating an X-parasite copy of Ceres and regaining her speed booster upgrade. Later on, she traveled through the lower reaches of the sector from the destroyed Sector 5 and used the opportunity to download data on the diffusion missiles into her systems and activate security level 4 hatches without authorization. Before we take a good look at the unique biota of this area, it's important to note that, as far as previously covered organisms go, this area was also home to the Ghidorah, Cargo, Ouch, Geron, Sizer, and Gold Sizer. Now then, let's start our examination of the unique beasts that can be found in this aquatic paradise. The yard was an uncommon mollusk only known to naturally exist in the waters of Meridia on Zebes, that was usually less of a concern than most of the wildlife there as a result of their limited offensive capabilities. Unlike other mollusks, these creatures actually possess some hard parts aside from the shell in the form of two small crab-like pinchers that they used to grasp onto prey and hold them down while they spat a corrosive enzyme that liquefied them into a form that the yard could then easily devour. Its small stalked eyes were not the best when it came to seeing complex shapes and colors, but they did have a limited visual system that allowed them to see enough in the way of basic colors and shapes to get through their lives. While these monsters were relatively brutal against creatures that are smaller than them, they were not powerful enough to be a serious threat towards humans, as the most they could do to attack was aggressively ram a target when it wasn't paying attention. Thankfully for the yard though, it didn't have to worry too much about offense, as its shell was so sturdy that it could not be harmed by basic beam and missile weapons, requiring morph ball bombs, power bombs, or the speed booster to break. Moreover, if they came into direct contact with something, the yard would quickly pull its body into its shell and would allow it to be kicked around, bouncing off hard surfaces until its attacker gave up and it could safely come back out or launch a counterattack. It is less known that the yards were among the many creatures that were killed and copied by X-parasites aboard the B.S.L research station. These mutated copies possessed a much larger spiral shell form compared to the original yard, a bluish coloration in comparison to the green body and silver shell coloration of the original, and it gained the ability to generate and fire boomerang-like energy projectiles from afar. This came at a cost, however, as their shell was not as sturdy as that of a normal yard and could be harmed with both missile weapons and charged beam shots, but the capacity to actually harm others from afar effectively nonetheless helps to bump them up to threat level beta. In aquatic areas such as Sector 4, if an X-copy Zebesian was present when an X-copy Sculptera was killed, there is a high possibility that the freed X-parasite would float over and forcibly combine itself with the Zebesian clone to form a mermaid pirate, which had the front half of a normal Zebesian, but the back half of a fish complete with a tail and fins. This strange mutation allowed them to indefinitely live and move around in the water, but in doing so they gained no noticeable increase in the amount of damage they could actually receive, and in fact grew a bit weaker in power, as the long green energy beams they usually fired from their claws were reduced to shorter red beams. Still, they could prove to be a unique threat to have to deal with without concussive firepower to easily eliminate them, and occupy a decent niche within threat level beta. The Sculptera was a small bony fish that was really much of an issue to deal with as a result of its benign nature, though this might not have always been proven to be the case for stronger specimens. The Sculptera was a little different from most types of fish in that it actually had two different life cycle stages that were designed for two completely different lifestyles. Normal Sculptera had the appearance of medium-sized fish, possessing a very similar skeletal structure and organ systems. However, they were set apart from other types of fish because they actually did not have a scaly outer skin at all. Instead, the bodies of these creatures were coated with a thick layer of brown or purple material similar to hardened skin that gave them a rock-like appearance and granted them a surprising amount of resilience against direct attack, though they could still be eliminated with minor gunfire. Moreover, their entire body structure had a jointed form that made their bodily movements seem more artificial than natural, despite the fact that they were living creatures. In this stage, Sculptera used their purple or brown color camouflage to blend in near the bottom of the ocean bodies they occupied, while feeding on smaller fish and other creatures in the native habitat. They were normally non-aggressive in this state, but if present in schools, they might have tried to attack larger creatures in order to use the numbers game to score a free meal. As these fish grew and developed, they eventually would reproduce and immediately mutate into a new form. In this transformation, they became a metallic grey color, grew to nearly twice their normal size, and developed a thick bony protrusion on the front of their head that could increase the amount of damage they could sustain by a considerable amount. These Sculptera were much more vicious than the smaller brethren, and would attack just about anything that entered their territory, using their large jaws and sharp teeth to rip apart prey in a bloody display of primal violence. It is also noted here that both varieties of the Sculptera were among the many creatures that were killed and copied by X-parasites aboard the B.S.L research station. Behaviorally and anatomically, these copies were effectively identical to the original creature, and could only take a little bit more damage than normal. The only major difference is that a smaller Sculptera could turn into a mutated adult state if allowed to absorb another X-parasite, and these larger Sculptera possessed even thicker protrusions on their heads that rendered them only weak to damage from charged beam shots and missile weapons. As a whole, these creatures had to be destroyed if encountered, as they would not stop pursuing the target unless they died or got out of the water, and this aggression could make them a noble issue for explorers to deal with if they couldn't be put down with heavy weaponry, in turn securing them a solid footing within threat level beta. The powamp was a marine invertebrate that used the power of air in order to make the most of its limited biological equipment. The main body of the powamp consisted of little more than a small segmented torso where all the creature's vital organs were crammed into, a massive pair of eyes built for thermal imaging, and a trio of paddle-like appendages that the creatures used to slowly paddle through open water. The most definitive feature of the powamp, though, was the massive flotation sac that was attached to their head. This elastic rubbery sac was filled with varying amounts of air in order to allow the creatures to float up and down in the water column, an artificial ballast that made it possible for them to maximize the amount of area they could actually patrol in the search for small zooplankton to feed on, as it was the only prey the gills right below the eyes could feed on. This sac did not just exist for utility purposes though, as it also hid a dark secret for anyone foolish enough to attack these creatures. At the base of this sac, powamp generated a series of artificial spines that helped to prop up the sac when it was not inflated with air, making it easier to inflate quickly. If the sac or main body was ruptured by the attack of a predator, these monsters would fire all of these spines by forcefully blasting water from the gills into the sac above, releasing a torrent of projectiles around them intended to impale and hopefully kill their attacker. This feature alone made these invertebrates worth avoiding at all costs, as they were completely harmless otherwise, but for those with the right equipment, they could actually be quite useful, as they could be frozen readily to be used as platforms, and had enough magnetic materials concentrated into the exoskeletons for protection that they could be latched onto with grapple beam technology. However, it is noted that these monsters were among the many that were destroyed and copied by X-parasites aboard the B.S.L research station. In this mutated form, their body color was slightly different with a similar color scheme as the X-parasite copy of the Ouch. They had developed a thicker flotation sac adorned with sharp spines that could easily hurt anything that came in direct contact with them, and they had become resistant to all forms of damage aside from the destructive force of the screw attack. Moreover, they had developed small lungs that could help them breathe out of the water, and thus enable them to sit around narrow openings and use the spiky flotation sacs to block off corridors, though weapons like the ice and diffusion missiles could still be used to freeze them in place. Even with this added durability, these monsters couldn't so easily fire spines from their bodies, and thus couldn't attack as well as the original organism, leaving them within the confines of threat level beta. The Avir were aquatic arthropods that are relatively rare in the waters of Meridia, but are otherwise some of the most dominant predators there, and can more than prove to be a dominating presence if needed. With a body form similar to that of a crustacean, the Avir was a human-sized beast with a plated outer shell on its back, a pair of unflinching eyes, and a soft underbelly that was guarded by them fiercely, as was the only part of the body that was actually vulnerable to attack. The Avir lived in the sand pits and pools that had been created by space pirate forces in excavating Meridia and setting up a research base. They were generally calm creatures that spent their time dining on small arthropods without worrying too much about being attacked, but they were still able to defend themselves by firing the tips of their tails like a straight-shot missile at targets that detonated when they struck as a result of a shock-vulnerable chemical compound contained in the detachable object, inflicting minor damage and usually deterring targets from attacking again. As observed in the native environments, Avirs came in two basic stages of development. When they were young, they possessed a brownish-green shell and body color and lime-green eyes. In this state, they had to feed on plankton because their bodies were too weak and frail for them to sustain much in the way of gunfire and thus live outside the safety of their parents' lair. Once the shell hardens, however, it would turn green while their belly becomes yellowish and their eyes shifted to a pink color. It is only in this stage that Avirs can be considered a hazard, but while they might have had the strange power to fire right through floors and hurt others above them, potentially due to the explosive nature of the projectile attacks, they were still fairly benign and usually would not attack directly unless provoked. It is then lastly noted these creatures were also among the many that are killed and copied by X-parasites aboard the B.S.L research station. This mutant form possessed a reddish-orange hue to its shell and green eyes, and had the ability to not only fire projectiles from its tail like the original creature, but could use electromagnetism to attract them around their bodies, forming a barrier of explosive tail parts that could easily hurt anything foolish enough to get near them. This did not do much to add to the overall aggression and defensive capabilities, however, so they still retain the same place as the original entities, in threat level Beta. Ceres was a rare life form kept inside of Sector 4 of the B.S.L research station that ultimately proved to be incapable of surviving the damaged station once the X-parasites started to invade the area. Ceres was a serpentine aquatic predator taken from an undisclosed planet that specialized in using high-speed attacks in order to hunt for prey. Instead of using traditional sight in order to observe its prey, Ceres used an advanced sonar system to detect minute vibrations in the water to see prey from a distance. Instead of using traditional sight in order to observe its prey, Ceres used an advanced sonar system to detect minute vibrations in the water to see prey from a distance. To ensure that it never lost sight of its prey, the creature had the power to accelerate from a standstill to close to half the speed of sound, rocketing forward with such velocity that it would oftentimes swallow its prey whole. Though if needed, it could still deliver a powerful bite to larger creatures and rip off massive hunks of flesh using its inward-facing teeth, which were further benefited by the fact that the creature's unique jaw-hinge structure allowed it to effectively bite down while leaving its lower jaw in place, enabling it to then rocket off with its speed-boosting power to slice off huge hunks of beef from a prey item. It is still uncertain just how Ceres is able to move at such incredible speeds and so quickly from a standstill, but it seems to be the product of an advanced muscular system that can store massive amounts of elastic potential energy in the creature's muscle fibers and tendons, making its entire body a massive spring that can be internally compressed to the point of near rupture before releasing the tension. When the hunter first entered Sector 4 of the station, the upper portions of the sector were heavily damaged. While most of the direct destruction of platforms and parts of the area to expose the water to live electrical wires seems to have been the deliberate action of an SAX to free Ceres, most of the other mindless destruction observed was attributed to Ceres itself, though for what reason it was let out it was uncertain at the time of her arrival. By the time the hunter reached Ceres' breeding tank though, which it returned to periodically to rest, he found the truth in observing the skeleton of the beast inside the tank, only to encounter it again in the next room over. The X-parasites had killed Ceres and assumed its form to cause the destruction witnessed, bringing with it the power of the hunter's speed booster as well. Since the Ceres copy could not see the hunter directly, its attack pattern consisted mainly of just weaving up and down around the platforms and the secondary tank the two were contained in, following a set course that never really seemed to change all that much and thus making it fairly easy to predict the creature's moves. The body of Ceres, likewise its copy, was heavily armored and effectively impervious to damage, but the creature's brain was only protected by a thin sheath of transparent material, so it's not as well defended and thus susceptible to damage from missiles and charged beam shots. Killing the monster was not easy though, as every time the hunter hit it, the entity would pause before entering a hyperactive state in which it would glow brightly and move much faster than normal, thus making it hard to avoid as well as invincible as long as his energy surge lasted. Thankfully though, Ceres' copy was not that resilient against damage, as it was not too long after the start of the fight that the monster took too much damage to handle. As the monster died, its body segments detonated one by one as its head spun frantically before reverting to a Corex form. From here, the hunter was able to finish off the monster easily, and as a reward for her efforts, she absorbed the Corex and gained the mutant's upgraded speed in the form of the speed booster. While it is still uncertain as to what sort of creature Ceres was to begin with, and where it came from, with the enhancement of the speed booster in its system, the monster still proved to be a fearsome and dangerous creature to handle with all quick reflexes, and earns a solid place within threat level Gamma.
Now this is something more to my style. We're still trying to figure out just what sort of movement speeds that region came from. But from what little bit you know, it was not something you want to mess with, if you couldn't keep on your toes and do your best to avoid getting nailed by it as you swam around. From its body was harder than steel, almost impossible to damage while aiming for the thinner plating on its head. That just made it consider use the whole damn body as a weapon, as much as it felt like doing so. Hell, even gave me a run for my money in simulated tests, but I just chose to ride it and have the time of my life. Though, I will remark that I can't get the sounds of the screams out of my head. One of the most fun things I've ever heard in my damn life.
Sector 4, much like Sector 3, was noted for having more than one area to it, and thus could be a different beast to handle depending on just how far you wanted to go down into the facility. On the one hand, the upper floors may have had some pools of water, but they were otherwise comprised of dry land, and could be traversed by pretty much anyone that watched their step to avoid the denizens that could survive out of the water. If you really wanted to see the most of this biota though, you'd have to get into the large artificial aquatic habitats in the sector's lower reaches, and given that most of the beasts there were meant to live in the water, and you likely were not, it would require some serious scuba gear to investigate fully. Even then though, you'd best be prepared to be fighting against the water, as some of its most dangerous denizens wouldn't have trouble making a meal out of you if you didn't tread carefully. It's a bit of a shame that we don't get to go swimming too much anymore with this work. I kind of miss being in the water, even if this particular body of it could be more than a bit hazardous if you couldn't overcome the sluggish movement most will otherwise experience within it. Best to dry off if you don't want to catch a cold or something worse though, as the next step on our trip to the facility is about to get much, much colder as we head into the icy depths of Sector 5 ARC. Thank you all for watching this video. We here at Space Pirate Science Team take our work very seriously, and we genuinely wish to be as informative as possible when it comes to the work we conduct here, for both ourselves and in the name of science. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment to help us get greater recognition out there to inform the greater populace of the universe as a whole. Also, feel free to keep track of us through Twitter, as we'll be posting notices there every time something new is submitted for your viewing pleasure. We hope to see you all in the next video, no matter what world it may take us to.